Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for the launch of the European B2C e-commerce report 2023. My name is Luca Cassetti. I'm the Secretary General of Ecommerce Europe, which is the European Digital Commerce Association. Before starting, I would like to introduce you the other speakers of today's webinar. First, Jesse Weltevreden, Professor of Digital Commerce at the Center for Market Insights of the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, which in short we call CMI, who executed this report. And secondly, Anton Del Barre, Chief Economist at Eurocommerce, who is launching the report together with us. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank Eurocommerce for supporting this project and thank Jesse and CMI for the hard work on drafting this very comprehensive report. So just before leaving the floor to CMI for the presentation of the main findings of the report, and then to Eurocommerce for a reaction, I would like to briefly comment on the moving context in which this report was carried out. Throughout 2022, Europe was, of course, heavily affected by the impact of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. We had high inflation rates driven by increased energy prices, which put downward pressure on consumers' purchasing power. And the current political and legislative context is also changing with significant milestones occurring in the upcoming months. Let me hand the floor to Jesse, who will walk us through the key findings of the report. And maybe one last point before we kick start. There will be time for questions after the presentation of the main findings. So you can use the Q&A area, the Q&A button on Zoom, so you can type your questions directly there, and we will address those questions after the presentation. So yes, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Luca, for this introduction, and welcome everybody at the webinar for the presentation of the new report. I will share my screen. It's visible. I think yes. Okay, great. Yeah, as Luca already said, this 2023 report contains the figures of 2022, and which has been quite an exceptional year due to the factors that has been mentioned by Luca already. But I would like to add a third important factor, and that's that we have came out of the COVID pandemic, because the years 2020 and 2021 has been very exceptional in Europe and also in other parts of the world, because due to the COVID pandemic, and especially due to the measures taken by national governments, it was hard to shop physically in those years. And that also led to a huge increase in e-commerce in those years, which also resulted in a market correction in 2022, in combination with inflation, uncertainty due to the war in Ukraine, and so on and so on. So also us coming out of the COVID pandemic in 2022 also had a significant impact on e-commerce across Europe. That's also a factor I would like to mention before I start with this presentation. It will be a short presentation in which I will highlight some of the new figures presented in the report. And as Luca already presented, the light version of the report will be accessible for everyone, and which will be shared through the website of Ecommerce Europe, or it's already live, I guess, visible for everyone. I think. So see if I can. Yeah, I'm really happy that we pulled it off this year again with the team from CMI. I'm happy to work on this project together with Ashwarya and Sarah this year. And indeed, it was, as I said, a very interesting report. I think the most interesting thing were of course, turnover figures for this year, but I will present them in the last part of this presentation. So let me first share some other developments in Europe when it comes to e-shopping penetration and also internet use and some other facts. But before that, I do that, first it's important to understand which countries we had in scope in this year's project. The project included 37 European countries, which have been divided into several regions in Europe, 5 regions. So we have the Nordics with a lot of countries, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe. In the past, we also had, in some reports, had Russia, but yeah, due to the political circumstances and also the fact that we don't got reliable data anymore from Russia, we had to exclude them, unfortunately. There are some minor changes with regard to the countries we have in scope as compared to previous years. But that being said, we still have quite almost every country in Europe included in this report, I would say. All right, let's dive into some figures. Let's first look to internet usage in Europe, internet penetration. And if you look to the whole of Europe, 37 countries, we saw that internet penetration increased with 1 percentage point from 91% to 92% in 2022. And we expect that for the year 2023, it will remain around 92%. It's already quite high, especially when you compare it to other parts of the world, when you compare it to Africa or some Latin American countries or countries in Asia that are less developed. So you see that almost every European already has access to the internet. And I think the Europeans that don't have access yet, I think it's hard to get it further. It could, of course, we have some countries where there's already a share of 100% or almost 100%, so we could grow a little bit more. But I think we're already quite high in Europe, so I don't think that this will increase very steep in the coming years. It will steadily increase, hopefully, towards 100%. If we look to the EU 27, we see that in 2022, the internet penetration was around 91%, and we expect a marginal increase to 92% in 2023. If we look to the regions, we see that the Western Europe and also the Nordic countries, they have the highest share of internet penetration. There are some Nordic countries where it's almost 100%. And we see the lowest shares in Eastern European countries and Southern European countries at the moment. But as you can see, the differences between European countries are rather small, especially if you compare it to other parts of the world where internet penetration is much, much lower than it is in Europe. All right, let's look to e-shoppers and e-shopper penetration. First, when we look to Europe as a total, and we look to people that bought goods or services online, we see that the penetration in the total of Europe was 76% in 2023, and we expect a small increase for 2023 to 78%. So there's still, of course, a little bit more growth possible here than with internet penetration. And I think this figure in the coming years will gradually further increase in Europe. If we look to the EU 27, the bars are probably a little bit misleading because they are different scales and setups in the report, and this come directly from the report. But of course, we see pretty similar figures for EU 27 here. We saw in 2022 a 75% of e-shopper penetration in the EU 27, and we expect for 2023 that it will be around 76%. So it's a little bit lower than compared to all European countries, but still in line and almost comparable, I would say. Let's look to the regions. We see that Western Europe and Northern Europe, like with internet penetration, also lead with e-shopper penetration, with shares of above 85%. And we see that again in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, the e-shopper penetration is much lower, which is also in line with what we saw with internet penetration. But with internet penetration, the differences among countries in Europe are much smaller, whereas here in e-shopper penetration, we still see significant differences between the regions in Europe, which means that there's still a lot of growth potential for e-commerce, particularly in Eastern and Southern Europe, I would say. And maybe that's something that also Luca and Anton can respond on after my presentation. All right. We also have some information in the report about products and services bought by European consumers. This is data coming from Eurostat. And when we look to this, we look at the 2022 figures and see which categories are most popular, bought online across Europe. We see that at the moment it's mainly clothing, which is the leading category at the moment, followed by multimedia like books, CDs, DVDs, and also deliveries from restaurants are pretty popular, like meals and also cosmetics. Whereas other product categories like bicycles, so mobility related product categories, or cleaning and personal hygiene are still less popular when it comes to purchasing online for the whole of Europe. Of course, when you dive into the data for particular countries, this picture can be totally different because we see noticeable differences among countries when it comes to the preference of buying certain goods and services online. But due to the time, I have no time in this presentation to dive into that. Let's look at some popular service categories. We see that streaming and downloading films and series is most popular, but also buying tickets for events and transport services are also among the most popular services bought online by European consumers, whereas tickets to sport events and ebooks or apps related to health and fitness are at the moment less popular among European consumers. A little bit about cross-border online purchase. In the report, we also have this data for individual countries, but it's a little bit too much data to present in this general presentation. But what we see here is that, of course, it's logical that most European consumers buy online from national sellers. And when they did this research, they asked for where did you buy in the past 3 months when you did your shopping online, and we saw that in 2021, 84% of the respondents said it was from national sellers, and in 2022 we saw that was 81%. We saw a little bit of a decline, but we saw that also for the other categories, also from sellers from other EU countries, it's marginal decline from 32% to 31%, and also from sellers outside the EU countries is also a little bit decline. And this could be, of course, could have to do with the fact that we saw a migration of online shopping back to physical shopping in 2022. It could be an explanation, but maybe it's something that Anton and Luca could reflect on as well later on. But yeah, there has been some shift from consumers buying online in 2020 and 2021 back to more physical shopping in 2022, when the stores were fully open again with no or only few measures when it came to safety and health issues. Now, this could be an explanation for that. We also had some data in the report about the digital intensity of firms, to what extent they are really digital, whether they have a good ICT infrastructure and so on and so on, and how much they invest in new digital innovations. And we see some noticeable interesting results here. And when we look to large enterprises, we see in 2022 compared to 2021 a huge increase in the digital intensity among firms. So yeah, large European enterprises became more digital intense as compared to a previous year. We see a similar trend when we look to SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises, but it's less strong. So here again, we also see an increase in the high digital intensity and also the very high digital intensity, which is mainly coming from the companies that have a very low digital intensity. But yeah, compared to the large enterprises, I think the gap is not getting smaller yet. So they're gaining up a bit, but they don't increase as much in digital intensity, at least in the past year, as compared to the large enterprises. So that's something to keep an eye on in the future. So we're moving in the right direction, but the SMEs are still moving at a slower pace than the large enterprises in Europe. And more you can find about this, as I said, in our report. So I think now we come to, I think, the most important part of the presentation. I think maybe most people are waiting for is the new turnover figures. All right, let's look to how B2C e-commerce turnover developed in Europe in the year 2022 as compared to the previous years. There was an increase, so we saw that the total turnover in Europe was almost 900 billions, 899 billions exactly euros for the year 2022 as compared to 849 euros in 2021. So we saw a 6% increase, which is a little bit lower growth as compared to the previous years. But as you all know, 2022 has been across Europe a very exceptional year when it comes to inflation. We have witnessed a very high inflation rate in most European countries, which was very uncommon as compared, I think, to the previous decades, I would say. We had inflation rates of 10% plus in certain countries. In the Netherlands, for example, we had inflation rates of around 14% in that year. So if you correct for that, so if you correct for the price increase, we actually saw a small decrease in e-commerce turnover growth. So the gray line here in the figure shows the inflation adjusted growth rate of e-commerce, which was actually a decline in growth for e-commerce in Europe as a whole, so -2%. And this is also new in the report that we also are going for the coming year, are going to show much more inflation adjusted growth rates to give you a better perspective of whether e-commerce is growing because of strength or because of price increases. And this is also a big contribution by Eurocommerce for this report and also coming reports, and probably Anton will dive a little bit more into that later. When we look to eGDP, so the contribution of the e-commerce turnover to the GDP in Europe, we saw a decline in 2022 compared to 2021, which is probably also in line with the fact that other sectors boomed again in 2022 that are more physical oriented. But for 2023, we indeed expect an increase again of the eGDP, and so the growth will continue after a small decline in 2022. When we look to the turnover figures for the EU 27, you will see the countries belonging to that at the bottom of this slide. Here we do see, when we correct for inflation, a marginally growth. For the EU 27, we witnessed a turnover figure of 573 billion euros in 2022, which is an increase of almost 50 billion euros as compared to 2021. But inflation was pretty high, as I said, in this year, which resulted in a net growth of only 1% if you correct for that. But still, there's a growth, and for the coming year, 2023, we still expect a double-digit growth of e-commerce turnover. And when you adjust for inflation, we see that the growth is increasing a little bit as compared to this year. And I think for the coming years, the trend will be positive. So there's still a lot of potential for e-commerce to grow in many European countries, even in the more developed countries in Europe. When we look to the GDP and the eGDP, again, the contribution of e-commerce turnover in the total GDP, we saw only a marginally decline in 2022. It's almost the same figure as 2021. But for 2023, we do expect, again, a big increase in eGDP. Let's dive a little bit at the end of my presentation into some regional differences when it comes to the turnover figures. So when we look to the 5 regions in Europe, we see that most e-commerce turnover comes from Western European countries, including the UK, which is now, of course, outside the EU 27, but together with France and Germany, I think the biggest e-commerce market in Europe. So most of the e-commerce turnover is still coming from Western European countries, followed by Southern European countries. Spain and Italy, for example, are also pretty big markets. Whereas the other regions are pretty small when it comes to total e-commerce turnover. And especially Eastern Europe is the smallest, with only 14 billion turnover for all the countries in Eastern Europe. When we look to the share, we see that almost 2/3 of the e-commerce turnover is coming from Western Europe. As I said, Southern Europe is a good second, followed by Central Europe, the Nordics, and finally Eastern Europe. So I think there's also, like with the e-shopper penetration, which was also the lowest in Eastern Europe, but also still low in Southern Europe. So there's still a lot of growth potential, also potential turnover gain in East and Southern European countries in particular. Of course, Northern Europe is pretty well developed when it comes to internet penetration, e-shopper penetration. But of course, due to the population size there, it can't grow that much or much harder than it does at the moment, I would say, because I think when it comes to infrastructure and people using online shopping, it's already quite significant there. Finally, let's see the differences between the European regions when it comes to eGDP. We see the highest share of eGDP in the Western European countries, followed by Southern Europe and Nordics. And again, in Eastern Europe, eGDP is still the lowest, again, showing the potential of e-commerce there in the coming years or maybe coming decades to grow further. With this turnover figures, I've come to the end of the presentation. And as I said, we have already launched a report. The press release, I think, sent by e-commerce Europe and Eurocommerce is out there, which means that you can now also have access to the report, and through these QR codes, you can already directly scan them and access the report. So I would like to thank you for listening and getting some highlights from the report. And I would love to give the floor back to Luca and Anton for their reflections on this year's report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. It was a very comprehensive overview of the report's results. So thanks again to you and your team for putting together the report. I would like now to give the floor to Anton, picking up on the inflation-adjusted figures that were mentioned by Jesse. So Anton, what do you think about the report?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. What I'll try to do maybe is, as an economist, not just look at the data, but try to give the explanation, the reasoning behind why the data is like it is. And so I think that the elephant in the room is that we're coming out of 2 big subsequent crises, but those affected e-commerce in a different way each. And so we see that in the numbers. So basically what happened during the COVID crisis is that for consumers, on average, spending power remained around the same. There wasn't a big downturn in purchasing power, but a lot of obstacles were increased or introduced to certain types of spending. So what you saw was that as a whole, the commerce sector, online and offline, didn't really go down a lot during the lockdown. But what happened was huge shifts between subsectors and between retail channels. And one of the big winners there was e-commerce, of course, because that was a really good method to circumvent certain of the obstacles that were introduced by lockdowns. And that's an important factor. So you see that actually the importance of e-commerce within the total commerce, online and offline, grew a lot during COVID. But then we get into the inflation crisis. And the inflation crisis is a completely different beast. What we see here is not so much a shift within the commerce sector, but what we see is the commerce sector going down as a whole across all subsectors. The only shop format that was somewhat doing well was discounters, because they were gaining market share. And why is that? Consumers became highly price sensitive because they had a lot less money to spend. Wages didn't follow inflation. So that means that if you look at e-commerce for 2022, you had two elements playing at the same time. First off, you had the big shift from COVID that is illustrated, for instance, if you just look at the labor force within the sector. During lockdown, the job that was, or the profile across all sectors that was most touched by the lockdown was salespeople in shops. And there we lost almost 1 million people, over 900,000 people across Europe. And a lot of those jobs didn't come back. Around a third of those people, or a third of those sales jobs are now back, but 2/3 are still gone. But if you look at the total employment numbers for the entire sector, those are actually up. So that means that it's not that there are less people working, they're doing different jobs. And a lot of those new jobs are related to, for instance, e-commerce. If you have more e-commerce, you need less people in physical retail stores. So that is a first impact. The second impact now of the inflation crisis is that even while e-commerce is holding strong within commerce and is keeping its market share and keeping most of the gains it had within the commerce sector because of the COVID crisis, so it's a structural change. You see numbers that are going down in some regions, except for, I believe, Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, where the growth in e-commerce is still strong enough to compensate for the loss in purchasing power. But so basically what you see now is not so much the impact of the e-commerce sector within commerce, but what you see is the impact of consumers buying less, and you see it across all the subsectors and all the sales channels. And with the inflation crisis now ending, we see inflation numbers going down a lot since this year. And in some countries, you even have slight deflation or really low inflation levels at the moment. We expect that growth should return to the e-commerce sector. And the big reasons why it was a difficult year last year are now gone. And also the commerce sector as a whole should start recovering. And because of that, e-commerce as an important and growing part of the commerce sector should also be lifted, because a rising tide lifts all boats. So because of that, we're quite positive on our outlook for e-commerce. And I think if you have any other questions, you can always ask them to me, but those are the most important insights from our side when we look at the report.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anton. If there are more questions coming in, they can, of course, come through the Q&A section on Zoom. I would maybe like to add a little bit to this. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I will try to add a little bit more of a policy perspective or political perspective to the e-commerce report. Anton mentioned before the huge shift across channels that happened during COVID. Yeah, that's of course true. And we at Ecommerce Europe are strongly convinced that the digitalization has a huge role to play in the resilience of the retail sector and in the further consolidation of the single market. So we are working together with our members, trying to do our best to push this message through before European policymakers. I think Jesse mentioned something about a little bit of a decline in cross-border online purchase. Well, cross-border online purchase is still not where we would like it to be, if I can say it like this. We have a lot of legislation that is coming out from the EU, that has come out from the EU in terms of legislative acts that are adapting or trying to adapt the legal landscape of Europe to the digital and green transition. Many of these files are of key relevance for our sector. And just to mention a few of them, addressing online platforms and marketplaces, the DSA, the DMA, but we also have other proposals like the right to repair, green claims, sustainable packaging, and much more. So all these proposals all together, they of course have an impact on the sector, and we are working together with our members to make sure that our voice is heard in debates around this policy initiatives. So now these rules will gradually start applying to the whole industry across Europe, and they are going to require companies to invest significant resources to be able to comply with this new legislation. So the next few years will be critical to test the flexibility, the adaptability, and also the effectiveness of these rules to see if they really can contribute to the competitiveness of European companies or not. We're also going towards the end of this political mandate. So policymakers are at the European level starting to wrap up political priorities because we will have elections next year. Of course, we still believe that the need for harmonized legislation and more harmonized and effective enforcement remain to be a key priority for us. With more harmonization, of course, companies will find it easier to sell cross-border, and for the moment, that's not yet the case. At the same time, we see that digital commerce is at the forefront of new consumer trends, driving the transition towards a more circular economy. So we have second-hand shopping, refurbishment and repair sectors, and other circular solutions that are already translating political intentions into reality. So to continue their development, these innovative business models need an enabling and flexible regulatory framework more than ever. So as I said, we have the European elections taking place in June next year. They are going to reshuffle the European political landscape and probably also the narrative around digitalization and digital commerce. There are already some early voting predictions that seem to draw the picture of a more polarized and potentially less regulatory-oriented parliament. But of course, we will have to see after the elections. But this might have an impact on the evolution of EU legislation for the near future. So we might be in a context of increased political uncertainty. So it's really important that we keep advocating for good conditions for the sector to be able to perform a fair and sustainable digital transition. Maybe last comment from my side. We just celebrated the 30-year anniversary of the EU single market, but we are convinced that there is still a lot of work to be done. And while we recognize the important steps undertaken over the years, we still see that many businesses are faced with barriers, especially when selling across the border. So we have to reduce market fragmentation. We have been advocating for future-proof and channel-neutral policies so that we can create a market that is capable to respond to evolving companies and consumers' expectations. So I guess in 2024 and beyond, we will continue lobbying for the sector to bring the interest and the challenges of digital companies to the attention of the new legislators. And with that, I would like to close my my intervention and move maybe to the Q&A, because I've seen some questions coming in. The first one would be, I think, for Jesse, and it is about the source for cross-border sales. So someone is asking which source has been used for cross-border sales.
We used Eurostat for that.
Eurostat. Perfect, thank you. Then we have a second question, and this one is directed to Anton, about how the statements and info is shared about general commerce decrease affects FMCG. People cannot eat less or shower less or clean the house less, and yet there is also a decrease in FMCG e-commerce.
Yeah, so I think it's a really pertinent question, actually, because it's also been part of the greedflation debate, where some erroneous numbers were used. We actually did some work on that in our State of Grocery Retail report that we launched, looking at how the consumers shifted their priorities when it comes to fast-moving consumer goods. And I think there, maybe to go back to what Luca said on the policy work, we celebrate 30 years of the European single market this year. What we see is that the single market exists for consumers, it exists for producers, but it doesn't exist yet for the shops. Because there are still things like territorial supply constraints that make it really difficult for shops to really fully play their role. But maybe that's a bit to the side, but it is pertinent to the fast-moving consumer goods sector, where you see a lot of that. What we see when it comes to consumer preferences and how they react to having decreased purchasing power is that a lot more people, and it's across the income spectrum, so it's not only low-income people, but high-income people do it as much now, and that's new, as low-income people, is looking for ways to save money. One of the easy ways to save money is often to look at private label products. Is there a viable alternative for my current product in the private label market? And what we see is that indeed the market share of private label products has increased across Europe. What you also see is that, and it's linked to the private label stuff, is that people shop in more different stores. They start shopping around to get better prices. That's also one of the reasons why discounters, which have a lot of private label products, are actually doing really well, while all the other formats are suffering. So basically, if we look at it, people eat different, they buy different. For some of the brands are strong enough that it only has a small result, but especially where there are good private label alternatives, you see a big shift toward private labels. But what you also see is that some people actually do eat less, shower less, clean the house less, or they use a little less product when they for their dishwasher, for instance, or for their washing machine. So people are actually also rationing. And that's in part because of the decreased purchasing power, also because salaries haven't always lagged behind inflation. And so once these salaries catch up to inflation, that effect should probably diminish. But some of it will remain because people created new habits. So I think that probably answers your question. If you have any other questions about that, you can always contact me directly.
There was a follow-up question, if it is possible to get the grocery report that you mentioned, if it is available or not.
Yeah, it's not just e-commerce. So it has an e-commerce part in it. It's if you just Google State of Grocery Retail, but I'll type it here, then you can download it for free. It's a free report.
Okay. Thanks, Anton. Perfect. I don't see any more questions for the moment. So maybe Jesse, do you have any final remarks after hearing what Anton and I said from your side? Does it make sense to you what we mentioned also from the policy?
Yes, I think
aspect?
it makes fully sense to me, and I also fully agree with both of you that the future of e-commerce is still bright in Europe. Although we have some challenges ahead with regards to regulation and also sustainability that's coming. But I'm also glad that we have can leave some of the turmoil in the past. So we're out of the COVID pandemic, also out of the inflation crisis. So that's really good. So I think the 2023 data will be already more positive than the past year. So again, I'm looking forward to the new year's report. And yeah, with regard again to the question about the data source we used, I just want to say one final remark is that they're all listed in the report. We have a section at the end of the report where we list all the sources that has been used. For people that were interested in that, they can find it there. And for now, I would like to wish all the participants happy reading with the report, and have a great day, I would say.
Thank you very much, Jesse, and thank you very much also, Anton, for your insights and for the contribution of Eurocommerce to this report. It was a pleasure to cooperate with you again this year. And you know, I'd like to finish with a positive vibe, as Jesse said. The e-commerce sector, I mean, we might have some better figures in 2023. So I'd like to look forward to that and give you an appointment for the next year for the presentation of the new report. And meanwhile, you can access on both the Eurocommerce and e-commerce Europe websites the light report for free. And the full version is available for both policymakers and members of both e-commerce Europe and Eurocommerce, and the members of the national associations of both associations. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any troubles in accessing it. And I wish you all a good day. The webinar is going to be recorded, so it will be available on our social media and websites as well. So thank you, Anton. Thank you, Jesse, and looking forward to continuing the discussion.